Welcome back to another episode of the ScotLand Matters podcast, our first of 2025, which promises to be an exceptionally busy year for Scottish land and estates. We'll be working on bills and legislation covering areas from land reform to housing and the natural environment. Before the Christmas break, I had the privilege of joining SLE's Chairman Dee Ward at Rottal Estates in Angus to sit down with Scotland's Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands, Mairi Gougeon, where we discussed the challenges and opportunities facing our rural economy in the year ahead, with a particular focus on the recently published Scottish budget. We hope you enjoy listening to this episode, and you can find out more about our podcast on our website. I'm just going to kick off with a question that I think goes to the heart of what we're trying to do for rural Scotland in representing our members. And the question is, what role can the Scottish Government play in supporting rural businesses to boost the rural economy whilst still trying to deliver on our climate and nature targets?
Absolutely. I think the Scottish Government has a really strong role in that because it's about the confidence that we can give to rural sectors. It's also about supporting rural sectors and some of the challenges that they face. So obviously in my portfolio it is very broad, tends to cover more of the traditional industries, farming, fishing, forestry as well. And I also have responsibility for peatland restoration. And I think we have to recognise that the government has a role in supporting a lot of the work and activity that we need to see to tackle climate change and help restore nature and biodiversity, whether that's through the support that we provide for peatland restoration, for forestry. But of course our food security is important and food production is of course hugely important too. So it's about supporting our farmers and crofters and the role that they do in providing for our country in relation to that as well. So I think we have a strong role to play in relation to the different schemes and the incentives that we can provide, I think, for the types of action that we want to see happen and we want to help people take on the ground.
Yeah, great. And I'm really glad that Dee, as a manager of a rural business, could sit down with us as well to talk about these issues. So, we've heard that from a government perspective, but what about from a rural business perspective? Where do you see the areas that government can support you in building that resilience and helping you tackle climate change and nature loss?
Well, I think first and foremost, having a long-term strategy is really helpful because obviously farms and managing land's a long-term business and knowing where, what the direction of travel is can be really useful for us. I think there's opportunities. We all know that governments are struggling with finances both in the UK and Scotland, and I think there's some really good opportunities around creating the right regulation to enable the carbon market and the biodiversity net gain market to kick off, which I think will bring private money into these areas, which will help create jobs and other things. I think that's a really important part of it. And I also think on the food production side, I think that's really important. And I think producing food sustainably is important. And I honestly believe that if we can champion Scottish farming and get this good quality food, highly nutritional food into the market, and get people eating it. Mm-hmm. I think that, and getting people out into nature as well, and the mental and physical health benefits from doing that. I think you'll find that we reduce costs in places like the NHS as well. So I can sort of see a virtuous circle developing around it if we get it right.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word sustainability there, which is a theme I'm quite keen to pick up on. Obviously, it's the theme of our conference earlier this year as well. So we've had lots of conversations about sustainability. So the next question I wanted to ask was about how government policy, where we talk about the fragility of rural businesses, how government policy can contribute to sustainability where there is fragility in the rural sector.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Dee's absolutely right in touching on a lot of the, it's about the policy frameworks that we put in place and also setting out that general direction. Now, we know that there are rural areas right across Scotland and our islands face particular challenges that we don't see in the rest of Scotland, increased costs. And actually, when I travel around the country, it's always the basic infrastructure that we know can cause a big problem for people too. So, I think that there's a lot we can do in relation to that and trying to tackle some of the key challenges that we know face our rural areas and rural businesses. But Dee's also absolutely right. The public sector alone can't fix all the issues that we have. There wouldn't be enough funding for us to enable us to do that. But it's about having the right frameworks in place that enable us to tackle a lot of these challenges and to do that together.
Yeah, completely agree with that. I think that's really refreshing to hear from a government perspective. And again, Dee, from your perspective, where do you see rural businesses being able to build sustainability into their own practices?
No, I think that from our point of view, I think that I would like to see everyone on the same page, and I think NGOs and private land managers and farmers are getting more and more on the same page, because we're focused about climate change and biodiversity loss. And I think the government, obviously, we're united in trying to help government achieve the 30 by 30 and 2045 targets, which we fully believe in. I just think it would be really good to have. I think the private sector coming in is going to make the big difference, and I dwelt on this before, but I think we, as Mairi very said just now, we don't have the money. The government doesn't have the money to do this, and we need the private sector. But what we don't want is a private sector to come in and greenwash. So we need a system that works, which brings private money in a very altruistic way, where they're not looking for quick returns or big returns. They're just looking for long-term investment into actually saving the planet, which is what we're here for. So I think there's an opportunity around that. And funny enough, farming and land management go together in this, because if we can grow things like, here we're a livestock farm, if we can grow grass sustainably, we can be capturing carbon and developing nutritional food at the same time. The dung from the animals is refertilising the ground, which is good for the soil health. It's putting carbon back into soil, and it's helping insects, and then insects are helping birds and other wildlife and so on. So you get this virtuous circle. And I fully believe there's a virtuous circle that we can find with all these different elements in play, being private finance, NGOs, private land managers, farmers and the government working together.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, because I think one thing that frustrated me was just within the past couple of weeks, I was asked a question about, are you focusing too much on the environment and you're not thinking enough about, food? And I had felt like we had been moving away from this either-or scenario, which I don't think is the right way to frame the debate, because we can't continue to produce food and do that well unless we tackle the climate and nature together. It's about doing all of these things, which ultimately makes us, at a business level and as well as nationally, more resilient in facing all the challenges that we face. I mean, when you just look over the course of the past couple of years, I think, Dee, what you've experienced up here with the increases in the storms and the severity of the weather events that we're seeing, we need to make sure we're building that resilience in and equipping businesses with what they need to deal with that too. And I think returning to that virtuous circle element that you referenced as well, Dee, and the greenwashing part too, we want to make sure that when we see private investment, that we know that we need that it's done in a responsible way, and that's where we've had the interim principles for private investment in place. But we've also, within recent weeks, published our natural capital framework to really ensure that we have the right framework in place to manage that. And I think we have some good examples through when you look at the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code, which has been developing too. I think we have some quite strong frameworks in place for that responsible investment, which I think we all want to see.
Yeah, I mean, there's a strong theme of balance coming across from what you both have to say. That's balance in terms of public and private investment, and balance between priorities for nature and climate and priorities for delivering food security, which is really interesting to hear. Another aspect of balance when we're looking at the issue of depopulation is about public and private investment as well. And we just saw in the Scottish budget a commitment to increase funding for housing, which we're really keen to see back to sort of 2023 levels, which we of course really welcome. We also want to see a situation where private investment is really backing that up as well, and private development is driving the housing agenda forward in rural areas. But tackling depopulation goes to the heart of how we can support the growth of rural sector and build that resilience into our rural businesses. And another question I wanted to ask was what other steps beyond housing and better infrastructure can we really deliver from government to encourage people to choose to live and work in rural Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, I would say you have talked about it. I know you're looking for other elements as well, but I think housing is a key issue. There's no getting around that. And when I visit other parts of rural Scotland and our island areas, in some of those places, there are plenty of job opportunities available, but it's actually housing and affordable housing for people to live in, which is a significant inhibiting factor for the growth of those areas. So we have, and I think when it comes to addressing depopulation, it is a multifaceted issue. I don't think there is one single solution that we can implement that is going to fix it. And that's where the work that we're taking through in the Scottish Government in relation to the Addressing Depopulation Action Plan, there's a specific rural and islands element of that, is really key because it's multifaceted. I think the work that we're doing on housing is important. We have funds available for the Rural and Islands Housing Fund. We also have a funding available for key workers in rural areas as well, which I think is hugely important. And you mentioned the budget that was published last week. There's an extra almost £200 million in there for housing too. So, above all of that sits the Rural and Islands Housing Plan, which I think was published earlier this year, or maybe that was towards the end of last year. And that is about, how we can work with specific industries, look at the needs that there are in certain areas and ensure that we are delivering housing where it's needed. But there are also a number of other initiatives we're looking at. I mean, when you look at the gender pay gap in rural areas, there's a big gap there for women when it comes to employment. Mm-hmm. That's why we funded pilots in some of our island areas as well to look at providing basics like childcare, being able to do that and enable more women to get into employment. But we've also had a proposal for quite a long time that we developed in the Scottish Parliament for a rural visa pilot as well. I mean, we know that migration was going to be key for any population growth that we see in Scotland, and that's where the proposals for a rural visa pilot we felt were really important, because it's looking where there are particular areas or locations where, say, there's a skills shortage or where we could potentially have a positive impact. We could try and take that work forward. So unfortunately it hasn't progressed yet with the UK government, but we see this happening in other countries across the world, and we think it is something that could make a really big difference. But it's also about, more widely, how we support the industries in rural Scotland. That's, I mentioned some of the traditional industries, farming, forestry, fishing, but it's also about, when I travel across Scotland, the amount of micro enterprises and small businesses that we have, the entrepreneurship that exists across rural Scotland as well. So I think it's about how we can support people to either, whether that's starting their own business and help develop those ideas is really important. And there's a role for us in that, the wider public sector through our enterprise agencies. But I think I just see that there is so much opportunity in rural Scotland, and we want to make sure we're really driving and encouraging that as much as possible.
I was going to ask what you thought was the primary challenges facing growth in the rural sector, but I think from what we've just discussed there, that's far too simplistic a question. But Dee, I wondered if you could touch on maybe one or two of the challenges that you're facing that are getting in the way of growth for you and rural businesses in this area of Angus.
Yeah, I think housing is a big issue. It's you've got to look at housing in rural areas as little pockets of housing. It's not just building 100,000 houses in one area. You need 2 here and 5 there and whatever. And I think that it needs a sort of pragmatic view. So a lot of houses were built back in the Victorian era are stone. They'll never hit the EPC targets, but they do provide shelter and warm housing for people. And so I think we just need to be quite pragmatic how we look at things. I think the other area is around planning. It's it can be a very long and complicated process to get planning. Of course, then you have all the infrastructure costs before you even start building the house, and then the house becomes very expensive. And then if you want to rent that house out, there's a limit to what there's been restrictions on what you can charge and so on. And so there are a lot of annoying things that are in the way of making it happen. And I don't really know the answer, apart from if we could find ways to build housing in a more cost-effective way, so you can keep the rents relatively low, but you can still get a return on the capital you've invested into them. Yeah,
we've had a couple of budgets, and we've made no secret. And Mairi, of course, you showed up to speak to farmers outside Holyrood just over a couple of weeks ago. And I think your message to them was that we hear you and we want to deliver what you want us to deliver in the future, particularly to try to mitigate against some of the challenges they're going to face as a result of increases on APR and BPR, in face of increases to employment national insurance, CGT, and double cab pickups, which has kind of flown under the radar a little bit. So do you see those sort of additional legislative and tax burdens being placed on rural enterprises as a barrier to growth in the sector, or do you think there's actually some opportunities in there to encourage innovation and the kind of innovation we need to see to drive growth?
I mean, I think it is really challenging. I think in terms of the announcements that the UK government had made for a number of different reasons, I think what concerned us first and foremost was the fact that, there are no impact assessments. If there are, we haven't really seen them. We haven't seen any Scotland-specific impact assessments. And we know, as an example of that, I mean, one area that particularly affects us in Scotland that wouldn't affect the rest of the UK is in relation to our secure tenants, who will be subject to the inheritance tax and the agricultural property relief changes. So there are specific examples here where we know we'll be disproportionately impacted in comparison to the rest of the UK. So that's a problem for our tenant farmers. As well as I don't think it will achieve what the UK government wants to achieve. Now, that's not to say that we don't agree that there should be an inheritance tax, but you can't introduce wide-sweeping changes like that without fully considering the consequences of that, and also giving people some warning that it's going to happen, because I think there will be a lot of unintended consequences from that we'll have to try and deal with unless the UK government decides to think again. And it's also, I mean, we do have the issue of how the funding has changed. I mean, we've had concerns for a number of years. We've had annual settlements from the UK government, whereas when we were members of the EU, we would get, the 7-year period of funding. We could plan it accordingly over that period. It gives government more certainty, it gives our industry more certainty as to what they can expect over that time. But when you're subject to annual settlements, I mean, that was one of the big calls from the rally the other week, was about multi-year settlements. So we still can't provide that clarity at the moment because we only have a 1-year settlement and we don't know what's going to come in the UK spending review. So, and it's also the budget just doesn't recognise, one of the outstanding recommendations of the Bureau Review was that the governments would get together and talk about how that funding is allocated. So Scotland had previously received an area share of funding, but now that's going to be subject to the Barnett formula, which again poses more problems, and I don't think nearly goes anywhere near recognising the capability of Scotland, what we can do here compared to when it comes to nature restoration, mitigating the impacts of climate change as well. I mean, you look at our tree planting statistics as an example of that. We plant about 75% of what goes of all the figures in the UK, and we have so much more potential for that. And I think that we deserve a bigger part of the funding pot when it comes in relation to that. So I think businesses will always continue to innovate and adapt to what comes, but I don't think it helps when the rug is pulled out from under people and we see changes like that introduced that haven't been discussed with industry. And
I mean, touching on the Barnettisation, I think Barnettisation is my favourite word that came out. It's quite good. I enjoyed that, or unring fencing. But I mean, touching on that, how can the government go further at this point to give you the freedom that you need to allow farmers to have that clarity over multi-annual funding?
I think it's the multi-year settlements that we're looking for, because again, it makes it, I know that industry have been crying out for that for years, all of our stakeholders have been, and again, it makes it so much easier from a government perspective for us to be able to plan and properly you could develop multi-year programmes then, rather than, I think, the cycle we've been caught in recently. Actually, just having discussions about that this morning, where you get an annual allocation. If you are looking to develop a scheme, people have to apply to it. You need to let the successful applicants know. If it's a capital scheme, they need to get plans in place to build something to then use that money within a 12-month period, which is challenging for a lot of people at the best of times. And I think, we've touched on some of the issues with planning today as well. That doesn't make things any easier. So for all these sorts of reasons, it just makes it so much easier, I think, for people more widely, as well as from our perspective too. Yeah.
And Dee, do you have any other reflections on the UK budget beyond the sort of the surface level APR, which again farmers are protesting against in Westminster today?
Yes, I do. I mean, I don't always fully agree with everything Mairi says, but I absolutely agree spot on with everything she just said. But for me as a land manager, the APR and the BPR changes are unless that's amended without an impact assessment having been done, is a massive concern, because in the uplands we don't make a lot of money, and but obviously the land holdings tend to be quite large, so the cost of it, there's two issues. One, it's going to struggle to pay, so I will not be able to invest in farming or in other things I want to do up here, which will deliver far more benefits and for public, a much more public good. I think the other thing that people have forgotten is that money is now going to be sucked out and it's going to go to Westminster. So it's coming out of rural communities. So that money I would spend in the local community. So it's going to have a sort of trickle down effect. And I don't think that's been fully, assessed. And I have big concerns about that. And as I say, it means we will invest less. I do have concerns about the way that the rural budget is no longer ring fenced, and I know that was nothing to do with the Scottish Government. That was passed on from the UK Government, but I just think it wasn't thought through. I only hope that they have the magnanimity to step back and just assess it and see if they maybe have got it slightly wrong and they can tweak it. We all agree that using land as a tax shelter should not happen, but for farmers and people who live from generation to generation, pass it on, I think taxing them is wrong, because I think it's sending the wrong message at a time when food production is important, and we don't, as I say, want to suck money out of the rural economy. But you could, I think, have a system where if they then sold, or that you passed it on to your children, they then sold the land, they then have to pay capital gains tax, which is fair enough. And they surely can find a way to target those who are specifically sheltering from IHT. I'm sure it's not beyond the bounds of possibility to find a simple solution to deal with that.
Yeah, and because it still provides a relief in a sense on IHT for those who are looking to use it as a shelter. Yeah. But at the end of the day, it is those family farms who are bearing the brunt of that, who are the ones who don't necessarily have the cash put aside to fund their response to APR over the next 10 years.
But it's also, if they have to sell the land in order to pay it, that's where for tenants there's a particular problem, the Secure Act tenants, because they don't have that option. They can't sell land, they still have rent to pay, and they can't borrow against it either. But I think even for those owner-occupiers though, who's going to be buying it? It's not going to go into the hands of, necessarily next generation or new entrants to farming because of the land prices being so high. So it's,
Absolutely.
I don't
it
think
only
it fixes,
feeds into that concentration of ownership. And I think the other aspect of that is where you do have the ability to sell a small pocket. That's now going to be subject to elevated CGT as well. So, you're kind of damned if you do on the one hand and damned if you don't. I just have one more question, which I'll come to both of you on. It's about the Scottish budget, where we were slightly disappointed to see that the rural affairs budget was the only portfolio to face a real terms cut. Now, I know that will have been disappointing to you as the Cabinet Secretary for that portfolio, and to the rural sector where some frustration has been held. But we did also welcome the uplift, the tripling of peatland restoration funding. So there were a few positives there for us to take. Do you have any reflections on the sort of treatment of the rural affairs budget in that sense?
First of all, I would say that it's been, I think the funding that we've been able to, obviously we've rolled over the funding that we've received from the UK government in relation to the support that we're providing for agriculture. But I think it's also really important that, budgets in previous years have been very challenging and and particularly capital budgets. Again, when we were part of the EU, we would get a mixture of resource and capital coming through. But once we came out of the EU, it's only been resource funding that's coming through, and we know it's capitals where we really needed that funding. And last year was particularly challenging, where we saw a significant reduction to forestry grant scheme as an example of that. In previous schemes, we weren't able to run to the same levels. So I think, focusing on some of the positive elements of the budget, we have seen that was quite a significant increase in the capital allocation to the portfolio this time round, which is where we really need that funding to go. We're still able to support some of the really critical schemes for rural and island areas. When you look at our support for crofting that's been made available, also the AIC scheme as well, being able to, we know that is the key scheme for helping to mitigate against the effects of climate change and well as restoring and enhancing nature. So being able to fund that as well has been really important. And again, we've seen the return of the ring fence money, well, £20 million of that this year, with the remainder of the funding to come back next year, which is badged under the Agricultural Transformation Fund, which we want to have discussions with industry about how that can best be utilised, because we know there are a number of challenges, whether that's in the food and drink supply chain more widely, but also, are there things that we can look at there to encourage the next generation or to look to new entrants to the industry. So I think that gives us some potentially quite exciting opportunities. And because we know we've got the commitment of the return of funding next year, while we don't have multi-year certainty all around, at least we know we can try and prepare for that. So I think there are some good opportunities within it. And again, within peatland restoration, I think we want to continue with the progress that we've seen in peatland restoration. We know we've got to up the skills, ensure that we've got the wider industry, and that we continue to see that increasing. And with forestry as well, it is just unfortunate that over the past couple of years in forestry, we'd reached our highest ever levels in planting. I think it was about 15,000 hectares, which then had to be scaled back because of the funding that was available. But again, the increase in funding in that this year, we hope we're able to do some more.
Yeah. Okay. And Dee, I suppose that the follow-on from that is we've heard a bit of the detail, but on a sort of macro level, do you think that rural communities in Scotland could look at that headline figure about the fact that the rural portfolio was the only one to face a real terms cut and take that negatively? Or do you think people are sort of boring down into the details of this and looking at that capital allocation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I personally was disappointed with the budget, only because I think with all the mess that Labour have done with their recent budget, it was an opportunity to the Scottish Government to sort of stand up and go, right, we're fully behind farmers and land managers. I do appreciate that money's tight and you can only use what you've got, sort of thing. But I also think it can send the wrong messaging in a time when we're trying to hit our 30 by 30 targets, etc. However, I always try and follow with a positive. I think there's a really huge opportunity, as I've said before, to bring in private capital, non-greenwashed private capital, to help do a lot of these things. And I'd like to see probably that sped up, because what that will do is provide long-term certainty and income streams for farmers and land managers. And I think that's something that the government cannot guarantee, which I totally get. But actually, if we know that we've tied up a deal with Company X for biodiversity net gain or natural flood management or all these ecosystem services we can provide, or food production, whatever, but if we know that that's there, it gives us more certainty, and it means that we can build for the future. So I don't know how we get to a point where we're used to running off short-term budgets and we can lengthen it, but I think the private sector might enable us to do that, and that would be really good for farmers and land managers, I believe.
Yeah. And sorry, can I just add one thing that I just forgot, and it was just as you were mentioning it there, Dee. I mean, it's also, my budget isn't the only budget that spends, I think, for just thinking of biodiversity there, thinking of, nature restoration fund, and there's also the climate change package as well, which, sits in other portfolios but will still be spending in rural areas.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. And that, that's a huge uplift, particularly in terms of renewable energy funding, which again, SLE, we're keen to welcome. I know I said that last question was my final one, but I do have a final one. And, in light of that, looking at the budget and looking at where the Scottish Government's priorities are, the First Minister has been really clear on that and has made commitments along those lines. How can we support you and your team in the Scottish Government to fight the corner of rural Scotland to get more funding? As a stakeholder organisation, we're always going to shout from the rooftops about the need to get behind farmers, get behind the rural sector and support rural communities. How do you think we can take this budget, delve down into the details and get you more money for future budgets?
I think it's having that presence and being visible and just having those discussions, which I think is really important. I mean, the rally at Parliament the other week, I think, just highlights how strongly people feel, I think, and it brings these matters to the Parliament's attention, which I think is always a really important thing as well. I mean, one thing I'm always keen to do in this portfolio, and Dee touched on it earlier, it's about, well, you know, connecting people to the land, connecting people to food and where their food comes from, and recognising, you know, why all of this is so important, why support for rural Scotland is so important too. But I mean, I would highlight that, you know, we've got a First Minister who represents a Perthshire constituency. You look at the rural area that our Deputy First Minister, Kate Forbes, represents as well. We have, you know, a cabinet that has a big rural makeup and recognises, I think, some of the key issues there. Now, there's no getting around it. I mean, some of the, again, the budgets, even though it was seen as this massive uplift, I mean, a lot of that had been baked in. There are challenges right across portfolios. When you look at, you know, our health sector and some of the challenges that we face there, of course, we have to consider all these matters. But I think that, yeah, when you look at around who we have in Cabinet, the areas that they represent, I think there is that understanding of some of the key issues in rural areas. But I think, you know, the work that you do for your members is really important, and I would like to think that we have good engagements between yourself and certainly officials in my area, but I think it's always that reaching out and speaking to other colleagues as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much for that. Cheers. Relax. Thank you very much for joining us for this episode of the Scottish Land and Estates podcast, Scotland Matters. We hope you enjoyed listening to our conversation, and I'm looking forward to being joined by more SLE colleagues and guests in the year ahead. If you want to hear more from us, make sure you like and subscribe to follow along. We hope to see you again on our next episode.